Hey everyone, welcome back to Sleepless Historian. If you're watching this right now, you're probably already horizontal. Maybe you've got one eye open, your phone balanced at a slightly dangerous angle on your chest, and you're hoping that the gentle sound of someone talking about dead Romans will carry you quietly into unconsciousness. That's exactly what we're here for. Tonight, we're drifting all the way back to ancient Rome. Specifically, we're going to spend the next hour and a half or so meandering through the surprisingly complicated, occasionally grim, and frequently misunderstood world of Roman gladiators. Now, if your brain just conjured an image of Russell Crowe spinning dramatically in golden light while thousands of Romans lose their minds, I understand. That image is very cinematic. It's also, in several key ways, not quite right. The real story of gladiators is somehow both more mundane and more strange than Hollywood ever managed to capture. So go ahead, pull the blanket up, turn the lamp down, let the phone screen dim just a little. We're going in slowly. The first thing to understand about gladiators, and this is the detail that tends to surprise people the most, is that they were not universally despised. They were not simply slaves thrown into a pit to die for the entertainment of people who didn't care about them. The reality was considerably more complicated and considerably more interesting. Gladiators occupied this strange liminal space in Roman society. They were considered infames, a legal term meaning they had lost certain civic rights, which also applied to actors, prostitutes, and a few other groups the Romans categorized as socially degraded. And yet, they were also celebrated, wildly, embarrassingly celebrated, in ways that made respectable Roman citizens quietly uncomfortable. We have graffiti, actual wall graffiti from Pompeii, praising individual gladiators by name. Things like Celadus the Thrax makes the girl sigh scratched into plaster near a bathhouse, which tells you everything you need to know about how Romans actually felt about gladiators, regardless of what the official social position was supposed to be. It's a bit like how medieval Europeans would officially consider actors morally suspect, then immediately go watch the play anyway. Humans have always been very good at maintaining contradictions. Let's back up though, way back, because the origins of gladiatorial combat are genuinely murky, and historians have spent a considerable amount of time arguing about them in the quiet, intense way that historians do. The traditional story, the one the Romans themselves often told, was that gladiatorial games originated in Campania, specifically among the Etruscans or the Samnites, sometime in the 4th or 3rd century BCE. The idea was that these were originally funeral rites. When an important man died, you held combat in his honor. You let blood on the ground near his tomb. You gave the dead something vital and warm and alive as an offering. This is the story. It's a reasonable story. It has a certain logic to it. It might not be entirely true. Modern historians have poked at the Etruscan origin theory fairly thoroughly and found it somewhat lacking. There's not much actual Etruscan evidence for it. There are Etruscan paintings of men fighting, but men fighting isn't exactly rare in ancient depictions of anything. Some scholars now think the Romans may have developed gladiatorial games more independently than they liked to admit, or borrowed the idea from a wider range of Italic cultures rather than one tidy source. But the Romans liked the story. It gave the whole thing a veneer of solemn, sacred tradition. It made the blood seem purposeful, which is the sort of thing a civilization does when it has a practice it enjoys but doesn't entirely know how to justify. The first recorded gladiatorial games in Rome, and I say recorded because written records are always doing the heavy lifting in ancient history, took place in 264 BCE. That's the date historians point to. The occasion was the funeral of a man named Decimus Junius Brutus Pera. His sons organized the games in his honor. 3 pairs of gladiators fought in the Forum Boarium, which was the cattle market, which is perhaps not the most glamorous venue for what would eventually become Rome's defining cultural spectacle, but they were working with what they had. 3 pairs, 6 men total, in a cattle market, for a funeral. By the late Republic and early Empire, the games would involve hundreds of gladiators, exotic wild animals, elaborate stage sets depicting mythological scenes, and audiences of tens of thousands sitting in a building so sophisticated in its engineering that we're still impressed by it 2,000 years later. Everything in Rome scaled up. That was kind of Rome's thing. The men who became gladiators came from a fairly predictable set of sources, at least in the early centuries. The largest group was prisoners of war. When Rome conquered somewhere, and Rome was more or less continuously conquering somewhere, the survivors ended up in various categories of servitude. Some became household slaves, some went to work in mines, which was the worst possible outcome, the kind of thing you didn't survive for long. Some became gladiators. The populations of conquered peoples ended up defining specific gladiatorial types. The Thrax, the Thracian, was a fighting style named for Thrace. The Gaul gave his name to a type of gladiator before that category was eventually renamed. The Samnite was one of the earliest gladiatorial styles, named for a people Rome had fought bitter wars against in the early Republic. There was something about making the conquered people's fighting styles into entertainment that appealed to the Roman sense of order. It was a way of saying, symbolically, we have absorbed you. Your way of fighting is now a performance we watch on holidays. The Romans were not subtle about this kind of thing. The second major source of gladiators was slaves who were purchased specifically for the purpose, or who were sold into gladiatorial schools by masters who had decided they were troublesome. This was apparently a real threat that slave owners held over people. Behave, or you'll end up in the arena, which gives you a sense of how gladiatorial training was perceived even by people who watched the games enthusiastically. Wanting to watch was not the same as wanting to participate. The third source is the one that always makes people do a small double take. Volunteers. Free men. Sometimes men of relatively decent social standing. Men who signed contracts with gladiatorial schools, submitted voluntarily to the discipline and training, and went into the arena by choice. These men were called auctorati, and they were not uncommon. Particularly by the late Republic and through the imperial period, a significant portion of gladiators, estimates vary, but some historians suggest it may have been as high as half by the 1st century CE, were volunteers. Why would someone do this? That's a fair question. Let's think about it very gently, because we're not in a hurry. The gladiatorial schools, the ludi, provided something that was quite valuable in the ancient world: food, housing, medical care, and a small stipend. If you were a free man of modest means in imperial Rome, options were limited. You could join the army, which had its own considerable risks in a long term of service. You could try to find work as a laborer. You could become dependent on the grain dole and whatever scraps of patronage you could collect from someone wealthier than you. Or you could sign a contract with a lanista, the manager of a gladiatorial school, and in exchange for surrendering a significant portion of your personal autonomy and legal status, you would be housed, fed, trained, and given a chance at something like fame. Not guaranteed survival, fame. This was the deal, and people took it. The gladiatorial schools were, in a strange way, among the better resourced institutions in the Roman world for physical well-being. Gladiators received regular medical attention. We know this from archaeological evidence. At Ephesus, in what is now Turkey, archaeologists found a gladiator cemetery, and when they examined the bones, they found evidence of careful, professional medical treatment, healed fractures, evidence of surgeries, even evidence that wounds had been cleaned and treated in ways consistent with relatively sophisticated medical knowledge for the period. One of the more unexpected findings from that cemetery was the diet. Stable isotope analysis of the bones suggested gladiators ate a diet very high in plant matter, grains and legumes particularly, and relatively low in animal protein compared to the general population. They may even have consumed a kind of ash or chalk mixture as a calcium supplement. This led to one ancient nickname for gladiators, hordeari, barley men, because they ate a lot of barley. It's not the most glamorous detail about a group of professional fighters, but it's real and it's there in the bones, and I find it oddly humanizing. These very large, very trained, very dangerous men were eating carefully calibrated high-carbohydrate diets like ancient athletes following a macros plan. Rome contained multitudes. The gladiatorial schools of Rome were, in practical terms, a strange hybrid of prison, military barracks, and athletic training facility.
The most famous was the Ludus Magnus in Rome itself. It was built adjacent to the Colosseum, which the Romans called the Flavian Amphitheater, but let's not get bogged down in naming disputes, and connected to it by an underground tunnel, so gladiators could move from their training grounds to the arena without ever appearing in public before their moment of entrance, which was probably good for the spectacle and somewhat surreal for the gladiators. The Ludus Magnus had its own small practice arena at its center, rectangular, surrounded by seating. It was, in effect, a stadium built inside a stadium complex because Romans were not interested in doing anything by half measures. Life in the school was regimented in the way that military life tends to be regimented. You trained, you ate on schedule.
You slept in cells, small ones, roughly 2 meters by 3 meters, which we know because we've excavated some of them. You were supervised. You did not simply wander off to explore Rome whenever you felt like it. And yet, there were social structures within the schools that made them something more than just warehouses for violence. Gladiators formed what appear to have been genuine friendships, partnerships, in some cases, something like family units. The evidence for this comes again from funerary inscriptions, the ancient equivalent of obituaries, which mention gladiators honoring fallen comrades in terms of real affection. Words like collega, colleague, or terms suggesting brotherhood appear fairly regularly. There are inscriptions where a gladiator who survived funded the burial monument of one who didn't, where a trainer is described with what sounds like genuine grief rather than the formulaic language of formal mourning, where the emotional texture feels authentic, even across the distance of 2,000 years. These were people who lived in close proximity under extreme conditions, and who consequently developed the kinds of bonds that extreme conditions tend to produce. That shouldn't be surprising, but it tends to get lost in the popular image of gladiators as isolated, interchangeable figures, whose relationships with each other were simply irrelevant. Now, the types of gladiators. This is the part that gladiator enthusiasts tend to find genuinely interesting, because the Roman gladiatorial system was considerably more formalized and varied than most people realize. There weren't just gladiators. There were categories of gladiators, each with specific equipment, specific fighting styles, and specific opponents they were traditionally matched against. It was almost like a game with established pairings and counters. Let me walk you through a few of the main types very quietly, because this is the kind of detail that settles nicely into the background when you're trying to sleep. The Murmillo was perhaps the most iconic. Heavy armor, a large rectangular shield called a scutum, the same kind of shield Roman legionaries carried, which was probably not coincidental. A visored helmet with a distinctive fish crest on top. The name Murmillo may actually derive from a Greek word for a type of fish, which means Rome's most recognizable gladiator type was
Possibly named after a fish. Rome. Constantly surprising. The Murmillo was typically paired against the Thrax or the Hoplomachus. The Thrax carried a small curved sword called a sica and a small rectangular shield. The sica had a distinctive bend to it, designed to hook around a large shield and get at the body behind it. The Hoplomachus carried a spear and a small round shield and fought in a style evocative of Greek hoplite warfare. So you had these pairings designed for visual contrast and tactical interest. Heavy armor against light and mobile, large shield against small. It was essentially choreographed to be interesting to watch, though the outcome was not predetermined. The fighting was real, the blood was real, the danger was real. Then there was the retiarius, the net man. The retiarius is the one that tends to capture people's imagination most reliably because the equipment is so strange. A large weighted net, a trident, a long dagger called a pugio as a backup weapon, and that was essentially it. No helmet, a small shoulder guard on one arm called a galeris that extended up beside the head as minimal protection, but no helmet. The retiarius was the least armored gladiator type and also one of the most visually distinctive. Fighting one must have been a very strange experience. You're a heavily armored Murmillo, large shield in hand, and your opponent is trying to drop a net on your head while jabbing at you with a trident like you're an extremely belligerent fish. Roman crowds had opinions about these pairings, strong ones. There are writings suggesting that the retiarius was sometimes considered the least dignified gladiatorial type, Perhaps because fighting without a helmet was considered closer to ordinary vulnerability. Or perhaps because there was something about the net that felt undignified to Roman sensibilities. Hard to say exactly. Romans were complicated about dignity. The secutor deserves a mention here because it was developed specifically to counter the retiarius, which means someone in the Roman gladiatorial establishment sat down at some point and thought carefully about how you design a fighter to deal with a man throwing nets at you. The answer they came up with was a very smooth, visored helmet with only small eye holes, almost no protrusions or edges that a net could catch on. The helmet was designed to be net-resistant, which is a very specific design brief. The secutor also had a larger shield and moved more carefully than some other types, because chasing someone while trying not to get a net thrown on you requires a certain deliberate quality of movement. The fight between a secutor and a retiarius was essentially a fight between two very specific counter-designed weapons, which made for an interesting spectacle even if you were watching it from very far away. There were other types, the Dimachurus, who fought with two swords, the Scissor, who had a bizarre rotating half-moon blade on one arm, the Equites, who began fights on horseback before dismounting. But we'll let those drift past for now. The main point is that this was a structured, formalized system with a great deal of institutional knowledge built up around it over centuries. It was, strange as it sounds, a profession, with career development, with specialists, with techniques passed down through trainers and schools. The doctores, the trainers, were a crucial part of this system. Many of them were retired gladiators themselves. Men who had survived long enough or been granted freedom or bought their freedom with winnings, and who had taken their accumulated knowledge of violence and turned it into instruction. This was a viable career path. Fight long enough, win enough, survive, then teach. We know the names of some of these trainers from inscriptions. We know they were respected figures within the school hierarchy, distinct from the lanista who owned or managed the school. The trainer's relationship with his fighters seems to have been something like a coach, demanding, precise, and not without a certain investment in the men's success. Because successful gladiators were expensive investments, the training alone was substantial. The food and medical care cost money. A gladiator who died in his first or second fight had not provided a return on that investment. This is, I realize, a somewhat cold way to look at human beings, but it's also why gladiators were not simply slaughtered at every possible opportunity, despite what Hollywood tends to suggest. This is probably the single biggest misconception about gladiatorial combat, so let's settle into it for a while. Gladiators did not die every time they fought. They didn't even die most of the time. This is genuinely surprising to most people, and it runs so contrary to the popular image that it takes a moment to sink in. But the evidence is fairly clear. Mosaic depictions of gladiatorial combat, and there are quite a few of them because Romans liked to decorate things with gladiatorial imagery in a way that would seem very odd if you put it in a modern context, often include a symbol next to a fighter's name, a phi-like symbol that historians interpret as indicating death. And in these mosaics, it appears next to a minority of the fighters depicted, not the majority. Surviving records from individual fighters, those who left any kind of written trace, show men who fought 5, 10, sometimes 20 or more fights over the course of a career. A fighter who died in every bout would not have a career with that kind of count. One famous example is a man named Flamma, Syrian by origin. He appears in multiple inscriptions from the 2nd century CE. His record, as reconstructed from these inscriptions, shows approximately 34 fights, 21 wins, 9 draws, 4 losses. He received the rudis, the wooden sword that symbolized freedom and retirement, 4 times and refused it each time. He kept fighting. Flamma is interesting for several reasons, but he's particularly useful here because his record makes no sense in a world where gladiators routinely died. You don't accumulate 34 fights and 9 losses if every loss means death. You just don't. So what happened when a gladiator lost? This is where the famous thumbs up, thumbs down gesture comes in, and also where that gesture turns out to be substantially more complicated than the movies suggest. The decision of what to do with a defeated gladiator rested with the crowd and the editor, the person who was sponsoring the games, usually a wealthy politician or the emperor himself. If a gladiator fought well but was beaten, the crowd could signal for mercy. If they were displeased, they could signal for death. The gesture itself, the one everyone pictures, is a subject of genuine scholarly debate. The Latin sources use the phrase pollice verso, which means with a turned thumb, but turned in what direction? Hollywood decided it meant thumb down for death, thumb up for mercy. Modern scholars are not so sure. Some think it may have been thumb down or pressed against the palm for mercy, and thumb pointing outward or upward for death. Some think the gesture varied by period or region. We genuinely do not know with certainty what the gesture looked like. A lot of what we picture when we imagine Roman gladiators comes not from Roman sources, but from an 1872 painting by Jean-Léon Gérôme called Pollice Verso, which depicted the crowd with thumbs down in a scene of blood and spectacle. That painting became extremely famous. It influenced popular imagination profoundly, and it may have gotten the gesture backwards. This is one of my favorite small historical ironies. The image, so embedded in popular culture that it defines how we picture a historical moment, might be depicting the opposite of what actually happened. Anyway, the point is, death was not automatic. Death was a decision, and it was a decision made with some awareness that killing a trained, valuable fighter was expensive and wasteful. The crowd was often not bloodthirsty to the point of total indifference to economics. There are accounts of crowds demanding mercy, being moved by a good performance, by courage, by something. The death rate varied considerably. Scholarly estimates for the imperial period suggest something like 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 fights ended in death, which is still significant, still high by any modern standard, but it's not the constant slaughter the popular image suggests. Let's drift for a moment into what happened when a gladiator did die, because this is one of those small, strange corners of Roman life that tends to get overlooked in favor of the more dramatic elements. Gladiators, despite their infamous status, were typically given proper burials. The gladiatorial schools arranged this. The guild-like associations that gladiators formed, collegia, somewhat like mutual aid societies, helped fund funerals for members who died. There are inscriptions on gladiatorial tombs that record a man's fighting type, his win-loss record, his origin, and sometimes a small personal detail or two. These monuments were paid for by someone, by colleagues, by trainers, occasionally by fans, by wives and children, because some gladiators, particularly the free volunteers, had families. This is another detail that gets lost. Some gladiators were married, some had children. They might not have lived with their families full-time, given the residential nature of the schools, but the relationships existed. The inscriptions make this clear. There's one epitaph, sometimes quoted in histories of gladiatorial life, from a woman identified as the wife of a gladiator, expressing grief in terms that are unmistakably personal and real. Not formulaic mourning, but actual loss. She describes her husband with words that convey character, not just profession. I find these epitaphs genuinely moving in a quiet way. The distance of 2,000 years makes it easy to think of gladiators as a category rather than as people. The inscriptions push back against that. They insist on particularity. This man, this specific man, he had a wife. She mourned him. Now, let us drift toward what might be the strangest corner of gladiatorial history: the emperors. Several Roman emperors took an active personal interest in gladiatorial combat, not just as spectators, not just as patrons. Some of them actually participated. And the one who did this most enthusiastically and most embarrassingly was Commodus. Commodus deserves his own quiet moment of attention, because he is one of those figures in history who seems almost too strange to be real. He became emperor in 177 CE, initially co-emperor with his father, Marcus Aurelius, and sole emperor after his father's death. His father, Marcus Aurelius, is remembered as a philosopher-emperor, a Stoic, a man who wrote a book of private meditations that is still read today, that people still find genuinely helpful, which is somewhat remarkable for a piece of writing from the 2nd century. Marcus was thoughtful, measured, serious about duty. His son was not any of those things. Commodus was, and there's really no diplomatic way to put this, a narcissist of extraordinary proportions who became increasingly detached from any functional relationship with reality over the course of his reign.
He renamed Rome after himself. He renamed the months of the year after himself. He renamed the Roman Senate after himself. He began to identify himself as the reincarnation of Hercules, which was perhaps understandable as a piece of political symbolism until it became clear that he wasn't being symbolic about it. And he fought in the arena. Not as a symbolic gesture, regularly, enthusiastically. He trained with gladiators and went into the arena and fought, and the fights were not exactly fair. When Commodus fought humans, he fought against opponents who were either unarmed, wounded, or otherwise compromised. The outcomes were predictably one-sided. He also fought animals, bears, ostriches, various other creatures, with rather more genuine personal risk, though the animal hunts also involved significant assistance from handlers and traps. He claimed an enormous number of victories, thousands. Scholars suspect the record-keeping was optimistic. The Senate was obligated to sit there and watch this. Every time Commodus appeared in the arena, the senators, the most formally dignified men in the Roman world, the inheritors of a centuries-old tradition of republican gravitas, had to sit in the stands and applaud a man they all knew was making a spectacle of himself and, by extension, of Rome. There are accounts of senators chewing on their laurel garlands to stop themselves from laughing at inappropriate moments, which is very Roman. Commodus was eventually assassinated in 192 CE.
CE, strangled in his bath by a wrestler named Narcissus, which is exactly the kind of darkly ironic detail that history occasionally produces just to remind you that it has a sense of humor. He was not the only emperor to descend into the arena, though he was the most enthusiastic. Caligula, predictably, had an unhealthy interest in gladiatorial combat. He had been a fan since childhood, spending time in military camps where gladiatorial displays were common entertainment. He reportedly personally fought in practice combats and arranged for gladiators to be deliberately weakened so he could defeat them more easily. Hadrian, more soberly, was known to watch gladiatorial training with a technical eye. He reportedly had opinions about technique. Augustus, the first emperor, had complicated feelings about the games. He reorganized and regulated them significantly, imposing rules about frequency, scale, and conduct, but also genuinely enjoyed watching. He's described as paying close attention to combat, unlike Julius Caesar, who was famous for reading correspondence during the games, which everyone found mildly insulting to the fighters. Nero's relationship to gladiatorial combat was characteristically theatrical. He preferred other entertainments, chariot racing, dramatic performances, musical recitals that went on considerably longer than anyone else wanted, but he engaged with gladiatorial games as spectacle when political necessity demanded it. Marcus Aurelius, in contrast, actively disliked gladiatorial combat and made various attempts to reduce its lethality, requiring gladiators to fight with blunted weapons in some circumstances, while acknowledging that he could not simply abolish something so embedded in Roman public life without serious political consequences. So the emperors ran the full spectrum, from enthusiastic personal participation to philosophical distaste, which is perhaps not surprising given how many emperors there were and how varied they were as human beings. Let's drift somewhere slightly unexpected. Women and gladiators. This is a topic the Romans themselves wrote about, usually with some version of expressed disapproval and an amount of detail that suggests significant actual interest in the subject. The gladiator's paradox, infamous but celebrated, socially degraded but intensely admired, played out very specifically in the realm of sexual and romantic attention. Gladiators attracted devotion from women across the social spectrum, including women who had absolutely no business being anywhere near a gladiatorial school by the standards of Roman propriety. There's the famous wall graffiti from Pompeii again. Celadus the Thriax makes the girls sigh. Crescens the Retiarius holds the hearts of all the young girls. These aren't official statements, they're graffiti. Someone, or possibly multiple people, scratched these words into walls because they felt compelled to express admiration publicly, anonymously, in the street. Juvenal, the satirist writing in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries CE, dedicates significant satirical energy to the phenomenon of respectable women becoming obsessed with gladiators. In his 6th satire, a long, somewhat exhausting rant about women that says considerably more about Juvenal than about women. He describes a senator's wife who abandoned her husband to follow a gladiator. He names her Epia. He describes the man she left her husband for as scarred, aged, with a disfigured face and bad arm. This is the satirist's point. It wasn't about conventional attractiveness. There was something about the arena, about the specific kind of courage or danger or otherness that generated intense fixation regardless of conventional appeal. Juvenal doesn't like this. His entire satire is organized around not liking it. But the fact that he felt the need to write a lengthy, detailed satirical treatment of the phenomenon suggests it was a real and frequent enough occurrence to be culturally notable. And then there were women who went further. Female gladiators, gladiatrices, existed. This tends to surprise people because the popular image of gladiatorial combat is comprehensively masculine, but we have evidence. A marble relief discovered in Halicarnassus, modern Bodrum in Turkey, depicts two women in gladiatorial fighting poses. They're shown with gladiatorial equipment, in fighting stances, and most crucially, they're labeled with names that appear to be arena names, Amazon and Achillea. Arena names, evocative pseudonyms, were a gladiatorial convention. Suetonius, writing about the Emperor Domitian in the late 1st century CE, describes games at which women fought by torchlight, which suggests it was unusual enough to be worth noting, but not so extraordinary that he treats it as completely unprecedented. There are references in various sources to women fighting in the arena, usually described in a way that suggests a combination of interest and mild embarrassment on the part of the writer. The embarrassment seems to come from the fact that some of these women were apparently of free-born status, which complicated the social categories significantly. In 200 CE, the Emperor Septimius Severus formally banned women from gladiatorial combat. The existence of such a ban implies there was something to ban. You don't issue prohibitions against things that aren't happening. We don't know how common female gladiators were. The evidence is sparse. But they were real, and they fought, and people watched them fight, and Rome, characteristically, had complicated feelings about all of it. Let's talk about the building itself for a little while, because the Colosseum is one of those structures that rewards quiet contemplation. It was completed in 80 CE under Titus, though construction had begun under his father Vespasian around 70 CE. The Flavian dynasty wanted a monument, and they got one. The amphitheater seated somewhere between 50 and 80,000 spectators, depending on how you count and how tightly they were packed in. It had 80 arched entrances, so that in theory the entire audience could evacuate in a matter of minutes. The seating was organized by social class, senators closest to the arena, women and the poor at the top, with various gradations in between. The ticket system, if you can call it that, involved small clay or bone tokens called tesserae that indicated which section and row you were entitled to sit in. These have been found archaeologically. They're small and plain and functional, which makes them oddly touching. Someone carried these tokens to the games. Someone held them in their hand while they made their way through the arched corridors of the building. The engineering underneath the arena floor was remarkable. A complex of tunnels and chambers called the hypogeum, essentially a basement, housed the animals, equipment, and gladiators before they appeared in the arena. Elevators, counterweight-based platforms, could lift animals or props through trapdoors in the arena floor to appear seemingly from
nowhere. The arena floor itself was wood covered with sand. The word arena is simply the Latin word for sand, which is where the term for the space comes from. The sand was partly functional. It absorbed blood, which made the surface less slippery and made the cleanup between fights somewhat more manageable. There's a detail about the Colosseum that occasionally appears in popular accounts that we should address gently: the idea that the arena was flooded for naval battles. This is technically true, but historically more complicated than the simple story suggests. Naval spectacles, naumachia, were a real feature of Roman public entertainment. Julius Caesar staged a famous one, and Augustus staged an even more elaborate one in a specially constructed artificial lake. These involved actual ships and actual naval combat and were apparently genuinely spectacular. Whether naumachia were ever staged in the Colosseum itself is a matter of historical debate. The early sources suggest they were, at least in the building's earliest years before the elaborate hypogeum was installed. After the hypogeum was built, flooding the arena would have been structurally problematic, if not impossible. So the naval battle story is possibly true early on, certainly not true for most of the building's active life. What did happen in the Colosseum, beyond gladiatorial combat, included venatones, animal hunts. These were a major component of the games and deserve their own quiet moment. Exotic animals were imported from across the Roman world. Lions, leopards, bears, elephants, giraffes, hippopotamuses, crocodiles, ostriches, rhinoceroses. The list is genuinely extraordinary as a demonstration of Rome's logistical reach and its appetite for spectacle. Animals were brought from Africa and Asia across the Mediterranean, transported overland to Rome, held in the hypogeum, and then released into the arena to be hunted. The men who hunted them were called venatones and were a distinct category from gladiators, though they trained in similar schools and had similar social status. Some of them specialized in specific animals. There are inscriptions praising individual venatones for their careers dealing with particular categories of beasts. One inscription records a venatoner who fought over 300 hunts in various locations over his career, which is a remarkable number, and a remarkable life when you think about it steadily for a moment. The animal hunts had ecological consequences. The North African lion, a distinct subspecies, larger than the lions that survive today, was hunted to extinction partly as a result of the Roman demand for arena animals. The hippopotamus disappeared from the Nile Delta. Various other species were significantly reduced in their ranges. Rome wanted its spectacle, and the natural world paid for it, which is a pattern that continues to have some relevance. We have to talk about Spartacus. We don't have to stay long, but we have to visit. Spartacus is perhaps the most famous gladiator in history, and his story has accumulated so much dramatic weight over the centuries, the Kirk Douglas film, the television series, the general use of his name as a symbol of resistance, that peeling back to the historical person requires a bit of careful gentleness. What do we actually know? Spartacus was a Thracian, from the region of Thrace in what is now Bulgaria and northeastern Greece. He was enslaved and ended up at a gladiatorial school in Capua, in southern Italy, owned by a man named Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Batiatus, which is a lot of name for someone whose main contribution to history is owning Spartacus, but there we are. In 73 BCE, Spartacus and approximately 70 other gladiators escaped from the school using kitchen utensils as weapons. This detail, the kitchen utensils, appears in our ancient sources. They grabbed what was available. They fought their way out. It's a somewhat undignified beginning for a slave revolt that would eventually involve perhaps 100,000 people and terrify the Roman Republic. After the escape, Spartacus and his companions initially took refuge on Mount Vesuvius. Yes, that Vesuvius, still several hundred years away from its famous eruption, and began gathering followers. Enslaved people from surrounding farmlands joined them. The group grew rapidly. Rome sent forces to deal with what it initially expected to be a minor nuisance. Those forces were dealt with more severely than anticipated. The revolt kept growing. For 2 years, 73 to 71 BCE, Spartacus led what the Romans called the Third Servile War, the third major slave revolt in a century, because Rome kept having slave revolts, which tells you something about the conditions of Roman slavery, but which also tells you that suppressing them eventually became a specialization. Spartacus defeated multiple Roman armies. He moved up and down the Italian peninsula. He demonstrated military competence that Roman sources, reluctantly, largely acknowledged. What he wanted is less clear. Whether he was trying to escape Italy, trying to reach his homeland, trying to create some kind of free territory, the sources disagree and may have been guessing. Ancient writers were not particularly interested in accurately representing the intentions of Islaic rebels. He was eventually defeated by Marcus Licinius Crassus, the richest man in Rome, who funded his own army because he wanted the military glory, in 71 BCE. Spartacus died in the final battle. His body was never identified. 6,000 of the surviving rebels were crucified along the Appian Way between Capua and Rome, 100 miles of road. 6,000 crucifixes. The Romans left them there as a message that was, by any measure, emphatically received. It's one of those moments in history that sits very heavily, even at this distance, even at this late hour, even reading about it quietly in bed. The end of gladiatorial games is usually attributed to Christianity, specifically to the Christianization of the Roman Empire from the 4th century onward, and there's truth in this. But like most simple explanations for complex historical developments, it's not the complete picture. Constantine, the first Christian emperor, issued edicts in 325 CE that restricted gladiatorial combat. Subsequent Christian emperors expressed theological objections to the deliberate killing of human beings for entertainment.
Christian writers and intellectuals of the period, Tertullian, Lactantius, Augustine, wrote against the games with varying degrees of passion. But here's the complicating detail. The games didn't actually stop immediately when Christianity became the dominant religion. They continued, significantly reduced in scale, increasingly regulated, shifting in character, but continuing.
The historian's consensus now tends to emphasize that gladiatorial games declined for a confluence of reasons, of which Christian moral objection was one. Economic pressures were another. Maintaining gladiatorial schools, importing exotic animals, staging elaborate spectacles, all of this cost money. As the empire came under increasing pressure from both internal instability and external forces in the 4th and 5th centuries, the resources for lavish public entertainments became harder to sustain. The social function of the games also shifted. The games had been, among other things, a mechanism of political communication, a way for emperors and politicians to maintain popular approval through public generosity. As Roman political structures changed, this particular mechanism became less essential. The traditional end date often cited is 404 CE, when a Christian monk named Telemachus apparently rushed into the arena in Rome and attempted to physically stop a gladiatorial fight and was killed by the crowd. The emperor Honorius, reportedly moved by this, banned gladiatorial combat shortly afterward. The story of Telemachus appears in a single ancient source, and its historical reliability is uncertain, but it became the traditional endpoint story, and it has a kind of narrative neatness that made it persist. Animal hunts, the Venetones, actually continued well after gladiatorial combat proper declined. There are records of them happening in Rome as late as the 6th century CE. The Colosseum itself was used for various public events for centuries after its gladiatorial heyday. It's a slow fade, not a clean ending, as most endings are.